What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to FudgeMuppet. My name is Scott, and I'm here with Michael and Drew. A very different setup.
You're literally here with Michael.
Yeah, he died last episode, but we brought him back, but I only have a local necromancy spell, so he's right here. So, yes, today's episode is somewhat of a continuation from last week's episode, because we're talking about the Reman Empire, the empire that follows Alicia's some couple of hundred years later. So, Drew, take it away.
I'll kick us off. All right, so we had 2,000 years of the Elysian Empire, and then when that finally came to an end, at about 400, 500 years of just not much going on. And then in those days, the Empire of the Cyrodiils was dead, save in memory only, for through war and slug famine, which is referring to the Thracian plague, and iniquitous rulers, the West split from the East, and Calovia's estrangement lasted some 400 of years. So basically, nothing was going on for the longest time, until one king named Hroll had a vision of snakes, of the Akaviri invasion coming, and realized petty Calovian kings are not going to be able to save Cyrodiil. We need a dragonborn ruler. So he goes out in search of this dragonborn ruler, and he does some interesting stuff with a hill.
He does. He goes out with his men, and they come across a spirit that they see to be Saint Alicia. And Saint Alicia basically does a runner into the wilderness, and they go searching to chase her, and finally he comes across her, and it could be very metaphorical, but it says she kind of gets naked, and he ends up copulating with a hillock. So he thrusts himself into the earth.
Carves himself a little dirt hole and
carves himself a dirt hole on this little
just mining.
Just this mound of mud, and smashes it, and dies in the process. It was such a thrill. He dies. And anyway, some of his men come and see this and are driven mad, and others just kind of leave in shame. And eventually this hill begins to grow. And it starts as a small hill. It grows into a slightly bigger hill and a bigger hill, and people come to the hill and congregate around it, people from the area. And eventually it grows quite large, and a shepherdess comes and travels to the top of it and finds a baby there with the amulet of kings basically fused in his forehead, like a little gemstone in the forehead. It's a real Harry Potter story. And then she takes the child to the imperial city, to the ruby throne, puts the baby upon the throne, and then the baby speaks in an adult voice and says, "I am Cyrodiil come," which is quite literal in a way.
I mean, that's one thing to ask. I guess it must be metaphorical when you talk about the rising of the hill, because the Golden Hill, it's at Sancretor, isn't it, where he was born, which is where Pelennor screamed Reman's name 2,500 years prior.
Well, that's what kind of gives a little bit. I know that in itself is already mythology, like the songs of Pelennor, but it kind of does add to the consistency of the Ramanada, like the idea that he sort of at this spot had some kind of spiritual foresight of what was to come at this hill. Obviously, it sounds super embellished and crazy and stuff. But yeah. I think the idea that they're really trying to go with, even if you just treat it as a myth, is that Reman is the literal manifestation of the land. Reman, Cyrodiil is the name he takes on later. But he is born of the land. And if you were to say that Alicia is somehow spiritually connected with the land as well, it's sort of, is it's a nice little story to solidify your idea as king. I mean, if you want to be the real pessimist and kind of dismiss the myth as much as possible, it's probably that he was just sort of some kind of successful Calovian king who just managed to be a good diplomat and stuff and unite everyone against the Akaviri invasion.
Yeah, and the story would serve to just legitimize his rule, that he's the ultimate Cyrodiil dude.
And in the event that is the case, it doesn't really take much away from how important he is, because the Amulet of Kings was lost. He had to have found the Amulet of Kings and, you know, united everyone, and he must have known something about the danger that was coming to the north very soon in the form of the Akaviri invasion.
And simply put, as much as it's easy to dismiss the myth, he is in somehow an heir to the Empire by having the dragon blood and creating a new dynasty that could, you know, light the dragon fires and stuff. So it's not like you can just completely dismiss it like he's a hack that just came up with it all. So there's obviously some kind of prophetic element there.
I honestly, I just think the story is so cool. I take it as canon. I take it as that's what actually full on happened. I love the description of the story as well when he sees the spirit. It says, "And to this host appeared at last a spirit who resembled none other than Alestia, queen of ancient times, who bore in her left hand the dragon fire of the Akatosh, and in her right hand the jewels of the covenant, and on her breast a wound that split void onto her mangled feet."
So one important thing about that is Pelennor was always described as having a hole where his heart should be, that was where the Amulet of Kings basically bled shining light. And in that same regard, Alicia, it says that she has a void in her chest, which kind of, in a way, resembles how the Cyrodiilic people have strayed away from the Dragonfires and the Amulet of Kings. And if she's spilling void, that's essentially like a way of showing that the barrier between Oblivion, the Void, and Mundus is severed and needs to be, you know, bound up again.
It's cool too that part of, like, both with Pelennor having said to have a red diamond in his chest and her when it's missing and there's void spilling out, but the whole idea too with it being the blood of Lorcan that fell into an Ayleid well and was fashioned into that big soul gem. Also the whole idea that, like, Lorcan is a god that's obviously missing his heart and is dead. It's the same kind of imagery and stuff there with Alicia missing a heart and void spilling out kind of thing. It's cool. It's cool. But so there's lots of cool mythology there. Lots of cool mythology. But in terms of the more tangible actions, I guess, is that the big problem is there was an Akaviri invasion coming. And this is the first Akaviri invasion of Tamriel. And it comes in through Skyrim and then starts blazing a trail straight down through into Cyrodiil. And that's where we have the infamous Battle of Pale Pass, which is where we've got Reman, who's gathered together, united pretty much all of Cyrodiil to fight against the Akaviri invasion. But what's interesting is, we don't really know exactly what the point of the invasion was, but they do say that they were looking for a Dragonborn, which is, we've sort of speculated a bit in our Mysterious Akavir podcast, but maybe that's why the Sayesi were looking for a Dragonborn, someone who's capable of killing dragons permanently so that they could eat all the dragons, as it said the Sayesi tried to do but failed. But so they have said to kneel before Reman at the Battle of Pale Pass, and when they heard his voice and they professed him as Dragonborn, and they basically all swore fealty to him.
Yeah, and that really would legitimize his kind of rule as well. You know, anyone doubting his leadership, it's like, oh, now the invading forces who just absolutely slaughtered their way through Tamriel are kneeling before this man's feet. You know, like any doubt that you had is now gone. And if you disagree, you've got the Akaviri to deal with, the Sayesi, because they're under his command, and that would help him, you know, take over even more of Tamriel.
And it makes a lot of sense, you know, that they say that they specifically were not hunting. It said that they were searching specifically for him. And it makes sense, because if you're really invading for any serious reason, like, you know, to conquer, you don't blaze a trail straight through to the Pale Pass, like get cut all the way through the continent. That's kind of like a bit like what the Cameron usurper did, and you know how that ended up for him. It's like you don't just blaze a trail, you have to like do it slowly and integrate and whatnot. So it's pretty obvious.
I guess too what's interesting here, so he basically recruits a whole bunch of these Akaviri into his armies, and there's one group that sort of become the Dragon Guard, which is the famed group of dragon slayers and protectors of the Emperor, and also the Potentates, that basically there is a sort of a chosen Sayesi advisor amongst all the Akaviri who sort of advises each of the Reman emperors that follow and so on. But the other thing that's noted is all of the Akaviri fighting styles and a lot of their military tactics and such were actually combined with the legions. So basically on the formation of the legions, it sort of gave the sort of like ruby ranks that we'd see today in the way that it provided the basis for all of their military sort of preset, I guess. So, and using that, Reman then goes on this massive conquest. He goes on to take on Tamriel as a whole, which, if we were to compare it to the Elysian Empire, the furthest the Elysian Empire got was really just sort of, you know, right down towards Topal Bay, up into the Nibelheim heartland of Cyrodiil, and then sort of up across Dragontail Mountains into High Rock. So one big strip. But as we'll get into, Reman gets pretty far with his conquests.
Well, simply being able to unite Cyrodiil is a feat that, you know, kind of undid the Elysian Empire. They were never really able to tame the Colovian Highlands, whereas that was the first thing Reman did in the face of this Akaviri invasion. So it goes to show his might immediately, because it was a very divided province.
Yeah, and he kind of set the trend as well, in a way, of all the empires to come conquering Tamriel, or trying to in different ways, and also set the kind of standard as the empire being this more cosmopolitan faction, because he'd blended the influences of Colovia, Nibelheim, High Rock, but now also Akaviri influence, you know, and we still see that in the empire to this day, and with things that came from the Dragon Guard, like the blades and so on. So it's an interesting mix.
It's also interesting that he's probably, if depending on whether you believe whatever the story, the mythological story stuff, he's referenced as a son of the West, which is implying Colovia. So it's sort of, he was of Colovian sort of origin. So it's interesting that, like, because you know how they're usually the more stuck in their ways, sort of rigid types. It's like that. It's kind of good that it came from a Colovian type person to then go and incorporate other elements, because if it was in the reverse, the Nibelheim or you know, Akaviri or whatever, they'd have a hard time convincing the Colovians, if you know what I mean. Whereas I feel like Colovians would have followed him more easily, because he is one of them in his, you know, ambitions to create an amalgamation of the cultures. But
it's impressive. It's impressive just how much influence the Akaviri get, or the Saesi get in this, because, you know, they're foreigners who are pretty unknown to Tamriel, and they're the chief advisors to this empire, which is massive, you know.
Yeah, well, I think the way I sort of interpret it, I think like the way, like, it was really dangerous. Like, if Reman didn't unite them, the Akaviri just would have just taken it all, basically, all through Cyrodiil and stuff. Because the way it's described, it's just all petty kings and stuff spread around in miniature kingdoms. There are, if I'm trying to think, I can't really. There would be no big power bases, I reckon, because you've kind of got like. Maybe Skyrim, I can't remember if Skyrim's unified at this point, but you've kind of got like High Rock and its different kingdoms. You've got all of the Clovian kingdoms, the Nibelheim kingdoms and such. You've kind of got Elsewhere, which is always, you know, divided in some way. Valenwood, like, they're not conquering. I mean, you've got Morrowind being Morrowind, but they just sit there with their tribunal gods. I don't think there are any. Like Hammerfell, once again, divided amongst Forebears and Crowns.
It's kind of an interesting self-fulfilling prophecy, in that if King Hrol had this vision of the snakes, so he needed to, you know, to revive the empire and create Reman, essentially, and then the Akaviri come and they say, "We're here for you, Reman." It's kind of a bit of a, I wonder if it ever would have happened were Reman not born, with this great event not to have happened.
Yeah, it's almost like he brought them on over.
Yeah,
perhaps,
it's a weird.
Perhaps that's what Elysia wanted. I don't know. It's weird, but if they exist outside of space and time and all these other things, who knows what kind of reasons they have for their actions.
It's a theme.
Sorry,
go on. I was just going to say, it is a theme in the Elder Scrolls that prophecy. I spoke about it in the Singers video fairly recently, that the theme is that if a prophecy is told, it doesn't actually necessarily need to be magically prophesized. A lot of the times it can just come true by proxy of it being told as a story that drives people into action. And that's kind of potentially what happened here with Reman.
And it's especially true when you look at things like the Elder Scrolls themselves that kind of change and rewritten. Like, there is no like consistency to them. Like, the timeline's kind of always changing, and then you can get into the meta stuff that even potentially, like, you know, past even changes and retroactively and stuff, but it gets wacky. But I guess we can start moving into sort of the now establishment of the of the Tamriel-wide empire, because I sometimes struggle like there's little details about when and where for every province individually. Like there are some, I think it's Valenwood, if you got that.
Yeah, so I've got the timeline here. So basically the first Akaviri invasion with Pale Pass and all that was happening around 2703 of the First Era. In 2704, he divides the Reach between High Rock and Skyrim.
And that's a really important one too, because before then, like, and I mean, even for a while after, the Reachmen are still more powerful than they are in the times of Skyrim and so on. But like the point of that division was incredibly smart, because dividing the Reach into two and then sort of divvying up the responsibilities between the Breton kingdoms and the Nords, you kind of having them both vying over it, basically destabilizing Reachman power and stuff.
But it was very difficult. It was so hard to pacify them,
and
apparently.
Funnily enough, the Reachmen also get to like an all-time high after all of this. But
anyway, and then in the year 2714, that's when Valenwood is conquered by the Reman Second Empire.
So all still in his lifetime, Reman the First.
And then he dies. Reman the First dies in the year 2762. So 48 years after Valenwood's conquered is when he dies. And then Reman II is born in...
No. So Kastav.
Sorry, Kastav. Kastav is crowned. Crowned when Reman the First dies. And Kastav's Reman's son.
Yeah.
And he's not anything particularly special.
He's a bit of a loose cannon, honestly.
Yeah.
Do you want to...
So Kastav, he's the one who was said to be really, I guess, hard-headed and stubborn, and he really didn't want to listen to like the Potentate, and he basically ordered the Dragon Guard of Skyhaven Temple to seize Nordic hostages, and that was involved with something about conscription quotas leading to the Winterhold Rebellion.
Yeah,
I remember, Drew, you made a video about that. Would you remember?
Sorry, about what? Sorry,
about the conscription quotas and the Nordic hostages. I've put you on the spot.
Oh yeah, that's very specific. I can't quite
pretty
remember
sure it was
off the
just
top of my
along the
head.
lines of the Winterhold.
I think it was one line.
They just disagreed with the conscription methods and so on, and then because there was discrepancies over that, Kastav got hard-headed, and then he's like, I'm going to use the Dragon Guard to take hostages, and then that really set off a rebellion. Which
here we go. I've got the exact quote. So Emperor Kastav again ordered the Dragon Guard. So again, it sounds like he's quite persistent, to seize hostages from Markarth and Hroldan to ensure that the Jarls meet their conscription quotas. So there you go. The Jarls have conscription quotas, and Kastav basically gets a bunch of hostages and says, fulfill your quotas, or I won't let them go.
And by hostages, it's very likely probably members of the noble family and stuff.
It says this will make relations with the local populace more difficult, although the hostages are in fact housed and trained with the other acolytes.
Yeah, so that's a common thing in like feudal societies and so on, is like having a hostage. Like you don't treat them like a prisoner, but you're taking someone's son away from them and to come and train them. And, you know, they would be exposed to you culturally and so on. And, you know, a lot of people don't like that. But, yeah, it's a common in our world history to take... They're like noble hostages. It's not a brutal sort of, you know, terrorist hostage situation like you see in a bank or something.
It's a lesson learned from the Nords. And their, you know, Junal kind of brought that idea to them of taking hostages of war and things like that.
Sorry, not Junal, the other one, Stun.
Is that still? Oh, okay. Yeah.
You had a
See, I'm like very focused right now on how angry I get at the Imperials pretending to have conquered lands they haven't. So it's like, because the idea is that Reman, you know, he also conquered elsewhere. That one is in the texts and apparently used a lot of propaganda, kind of dehumanizing a beast race by literally calling them beast men as a kind of a means to help facilitate that. Yeah. But when it comes to Somerset, there isn't really much mention of any great conquest. It's, you know, like when you look at the emissaries of the Second Empire, they're only allowed to see the city of Alinor, and it's usually from a distance. So it seems to me more like the High Elves just wanted to tolerate the empire so as to avoid any unnecessary immigration to their land. They're just paying tariffs and taxes and whatever, just like, yeah, just sate them so we don't have to deal with them. And that is that, that's also the case with, I mean, we're going to get onto Black Marsh and Morrowind, but yeah, the idea that the Reman dynasty conquered Tamriel wide, it's much of the mainland, but that's...
So in Reman's time, I can't remember, did he get Black Marsh fully? Because it is said in retrospect, by the time of Reman II, they've only got Morrowind left to go. So between Reman 1 and Kastav, Valenwood, Hammerfell, Skyrim, High Rock.
I don't think Black Marsh was ever included in that. I'd be curious to know what
died
source.
In Murkmire, supposedly.
Right, so I'm not sure about
it. Says,
I'd be interested to hear.
I'll just continue on the story of Emperor Kastav. So his poor handling of this and other issues branded him as incompetent, and Kastav was deposed in the year 2805 or 2806, succeeded by Reman II. He lived for several years in exile, dying in the Murkmire region of Black Marsh in the year 2812. So I have a feeling that's Elder Scrolls Online.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if you
lore.
do check if you go to the Reman Dynasty, I'm pretty sure there's a mention of the date that Black Marsh is supposedly, we can debate the actuality of how far it was actually.
Sure. So in the year 2811, Cyrodiilic forces defeated the last organized army of Argonians at the Battle of Argonia, and the following year saw Argonia admitted to the empire as a province under the name Black Marsh. The rest of the province was conquered piecemeal, with the whole area passing under imperial control in 2837. But as we know, no one has really ever properly taken Black Marsh. They kind of take fringe areas or northwest areas and say, yeah, it's ours, and so perhaps work with other Argonians in those areas, but they don't really get to the heart of the swamp.
Yeah, so perhaps that's where our confusion is anyway, because the idea is that Reman II is the one who focused on Black Marsh, but perhaps they'd been fighting with Black Marsh before his reign. But 2811, the Battle of Argonia, is about 7 years into Reman II's reign.
Right. Okay. So Reman II was the one who sort of got Black Marsh and then started the Fourscore War. So he was really the mover on taking the East.
Yeah.
And because by that point, it's never really spoken about, but either Kastav, probably Reman before him, to be honest, took Hammerfell and Valenwood and such.
Yeah. Yeah, so Valenwood elsewhere, Hammerfell, and obviously we spoke about High Rock and Skyrim, is all explicitly attributed to Reman. Kastav, not so much of anything. But then, Reman II is the one who focused on the East. And it's there's a good quote from High King Emmerich from High Rock that essentially says, if I can find it, but it says something along the lines of the unconquered territory in the East was weighing heavily on him. So for sure, even if they'd pushed into Argonia, there's no way they'd made a great deal of progress. And the Battle of Argonia was it was when you see, it's kind of like, you can imagine it similar to Vietnam, the Vietnam War. If you were to say that the Americans won one big battle against the Viet Cong, it's but that's not how they fought. They probably put together an army for there would be big scale battles, but their fight is guerrilla warfare. Their fight is, the sabotage and the little groups of Argonians pulling off whatever. And that's how they fight. So the Battle of Argonia really doesn't mean anything. And I think for Reman II, he gets bogged down even after this great victory to the point where he just declares it's conquered. And because Imperials write the history, they're going to go with that. And they say, yep, it's formally conquered as of da-da-da, da-da-da. And it's cool, formally conquered. That means a lot,
Yeah, for sure. But anyway, so he goes on to start the Fourscore War, which is a massive war trying to conquer Morrowind. And I believe this goes for 80 years.
Yeah, well, that's why it's the Fourscore, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
20 years, yeah.
It's in the name.
But
quick maths.
Yes, so then that's a big background piece, but I'm pretty sure it's Reman II dies in this
they just about all do.
Yes.
By the end of it, at least. There's also a really cool part that I wanted to mention, because Juliek is there, right? And this is...
Well, he's a bit later, yeah.
No, Juliek is there in one of the major
Reman the
battles.
Third. He's Reman the Third.
War. I'm saying in terms of dynasty, we're like at Reman II still.
Yeah, okay. Reman II, though, does have a son.
Yeah.
Juliek.
No, he doesn't. Sorry,
That's Reman the
Third.
Brasilia's Door, and then Brasilia's Door has Juliek.
No, Brasilia's Door has Reman III.
Reman the
Oh,
Third. Then
God.
So you're way ahead.
the way I remember it, dude, is it's like Reman, not Reman, Reman, not Reman.
And only the
That's
Remans
the
are
easy way to
remarkable.
remember.
Boys, all I wanted to say was that there was an underwater battle, an underwater marching of troops with water-breathing spells in the Fourscore War. That's all I wanted to say.
That does sound pretty
so
sick.
cool.
Well, I mean, like we're pretty much done with Reman II, but like to the last thing to say about him really is like, as much as I've been kind of, being a bit cruel to him here, he's described as a master tactician, and he does something that the Empire does really well, which I talked about in the video, comparing the Empire to elves when it comes to rule, is that when he conquered new territory for the Empire, he established rule with a careful hand, avoiding too much disruption to local customs, traditions, and particularly to establish trade. So it's like, even though I think he failed miserably in Argonia, and we're going to get onto how he failed miserably in Morrowind, he was still a very good leader.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And it's interesting. So we've only got, I'm just trying to work out, it's only roughly 100 years of the Reman dynasty so far. So they've all been pretty long-lived emperors. But then we get to, so Brasila's Door was just basically not unremarkable. Apparently he was a really great combatant, and he really loved being up there in the vanguard and fighting and stuff, or chilling out in his nice estate near Skingrad. But he basically left it all up to Potentate. And I think this is the only other Potentate we have mention of, besides the ones that rule in the Reman Emperor's steads. But it's
Sidri Ashak.
Yeah.
And he basically let Sidri Ashak run the joint. And this was actually, funnily enough, said to be like his only wise decision or his smart decision, because Sidri Ashak was actually really good at administrating and making decisions and running things. So it was kind of you have to wonder if it was like out of laziness, like I just like to fight at the front of our forces and to chill out in my country estate near Skingrad, or if he actually did have some self-awareness and say, you know what, you're actually better at running things than me. It would be best for everyone if I just let you run things. But that could be giving Brasila's Door a bit too much credit. I'm not sure.
Another little just thing to throw out that happened during the Reman dynasty is the changing of legal documents of being High Elven into Cyrodiilic. So you first get that. It kind of reminds me, like, how that Latin was eventually changed, obviously, like the English and stuff in English places. But yeah, it's just interesting. You can kind of see like all of the Elven. This was like absolutely the biggest blow to Elven dominance ever, because this is basically a Tamriel-wide empire with the exception of Morrowind, and obviously not as impressive as Type of Septums in the way that Somerset wasn't properly conquered, and obviously he also got Morrowind. But then we come to Reman III, who is the titular character in the book, the last year of the First Era, and basically Reman III, as well as Brasilis, was kept on going with this Fourscore War. I guess that really was I'm sure they had other political things going on elsewhere, but for the main part, it was focused around Morrowind. So this is where the Prince Juliek comes in, and his fighting battles and stuff. And then we have the interesting story. Does anyone else want to take on the last year of the First Era story?
You go for it, Mick.
I was going to say, I wanted to tell my official thing I wanted to say before. So you've got the Battle of Bodrum, where forces from Vivek ambush Cyrodiilic army and almost completely destroy it. But then in the year 2920, same year actually, there's the Battle of Old Marak, where a heavily armored army led by Crown Prince Juliek took the Dunmer by surprise due to faulty intelligence on their part. Commanding the mystics in his army to cast water-breathing spells, his army passed through Lake Coronati, quote, Pirates of the Caribbean style, with the majority of the army commanded by Vivek being unable to respond to the attack in time. So...
yeah.
That's pretty badass.
Yeah, that's just super cool.
Do you know
almost so cool that you'd want to get rid of him as soon as possible?
Yeah, which is kind of what ends up happening with his assassination at the hands of the Morag Tong.
But see, and it's who... so the idea about who organized this is actually his potentate, Versailles, the potentate of Reman III. Because Juliek was actually in the midst of sort of... He'd done so well in combat in Morrowind, and he was kind of at the point where he was talking to Almalexia and Vivek, and he's like, okay, we're going to basically end this war and have a peace, and Morrowind's going to sort of enter the Empire and so on, because Juliek was even favored over his father as a potentially great ruler and so on.
He basically got them in such a position where he was forcing them to negotiate a treaty.
Yeah.
Like he'd almost won in a way. You know, he pretty much had won, really.
But then we have Versailles come in, and basically he organized the Morag Tong to assassinate both Reman III and Juliek. So, and that ends the Reman dynasty forever. Dun dun dun. But what's interesting is, and which we'll get to, is that the Reman Empire, the Second Empire, continues for, I'm pretty sure it's nearly twice as long under the rule of the Potentates compared to the actual Reman Empire, because I'm pretty sure the Reman dynasty only lasts like about 200 years. And then for about 400 years so basically when he dies, when Reman III and Juliek are killed, Versailles institutes the beginning of a new era, the Second Era, otherwise called the Common Era, and that's when we start counting time forward in the Second Era with the Potentates rule.
Yeah, so the Reman Empire, or the Second Empire, basically, like you said, is split into two parts.
Yeah.
There's the part with everything we just talked about, and there's the part with the Akaviri Potentate and Sayesi rulers and leaders and stuff like that. Which
you know is an argument to be made. It's like whether you can consider it a proper empire at all. I guess, you know, because it's not your Elysian Reman style dragonborn empire. But I mean, and one final thing for the Remans is it's a lesson: never invade Morrowind. Just never mess with Morrowind. The Argonians might eventually learn that, but there's no demigods there at the moment.
Yeah. Well, the Potentate, but there's a lot of interesting stuff happens. So a lot of the lore in ESO that you'll play, the empire that's only like fallen like 100 years, roughly, I think it's like 100 or 160, some 100 years before it, was basically just the Potentate Empire. Like the times of Reman are long gone by the time of ESO. But most of it existed under the Potentate, and apparently it was a pretty tumultuous time. Like because understandably, a lot of people don't like the idea of a snake man ruling all of Tamriel, and apparently, so for Versailles, he's what is renowned for implementing the Guilds Act and getting all of these sort of guilds, your mages guilds, thieves guilds, well, I don't know about thieves guild, but like other guilds, but most about the Fighters Guild, which was originally called the Safim, which was a Sayesi guild of warriors, and basically it was because Versailles, in order to get greater control of all of Tamriel, wanted to get all of the kingdoms unable to raise their own armies. So basically the fight, and they were all complaining, like, you know, because I want armies for protection and so on. So they sort of agreed that, well, there's this mercenary guild that you can use called the Safim, or later the Fighters Guild, that you can recruit for to do whatever you need to do, but you can't have these big formal standing empires. So that Versailles and the Empire are the only ones with an actual army.
And he also absolutely purged out all of the armies that were still loyal to Reman.
Yeah.
You know, there were still different kingdoms and armies that, you know, obviously, like you said, don't want to be ruled by a Sayesi snake man. And they're still kind of loyal to the Reman Empire and the Reman way of things. And so basically, what's his name? Versailles, he basically goes on what's called the Reman Purges, killing them all. And getting rid of any kind of resistance to their way of doing things.
It's a great way to keep your vassals in check. You know, you just establish Fighters Guild headquarters in all of the provinces under your control. And, you know, if you get locals who want to rise up and become warriors, it's a really good way to immediately indoctrinate them into your way of thinking, into being loyal to the empire. and all the while it's it's disguised, which I make it sound worse than it is, but it's disguised as something that's very beneficial to everyone. So it shows their intelligence of these potentates who have been operating kind of behind the scenes
it also,
for as long as the Empire's been there.
I was just going to say, it also kind of has a little bit more of like a dictatorship vibe, in the sense that once he takes control, he still retains the title of potentate. So it's not him and the potentate advisor. It's like, I am basically serving as the emperor. I'm potentate as well, though. It's kind of like I'm president and prime minister. You know what I mean?
I'm advisor to myself. No one gives me better information than myself.
Yeah.
But to their credit, to be fair, the Empire does last twice as long as the Reman dynasty does. And if you also credit the potentates, like is Sidri Ashak or whatever it was, the one for Brazila's Door, they kind of had, a reputation for administration and stuff like that. So, and they proved it, because there was only two, Versailles and his son Savrian Chorak, that run it for the 400 and whatever years it is into the second era.
Versailles was assassinated by the Morag Tong, ironically, and then succeeded by his son Savrian Chorak.
Yeah, and then he also gets assassinated as well later down the line. But by the way, there is I think there's a proper there's a lot of time in
between. They had good runs without being assassinated. Yeah.
324. Yeah, 324.
Reigns for 106 years.
Yeah, so there's a good amount of time in between the assassinations. But the Morag Tong notoriety here is what got them basically outlawed everywhere except Morrowind, and basically they were being hunted down. And we can talk about this in the Dark Brotherhood episode coming up in a couple of podcasts. But they Morag Tong had their schism, and this is where they think the Dark Brotherhood sort of came, around the assassination of Versailles and Reman, before. So, yeah.
I also forgot to mention the part where Reman II has Alduin's Wall constructed. It's just a cool little piece.
Well, that's is it? I think I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be Reman I's head on the big wall thing.
On the door.
On the door. Yeah, and his likeness.
Yeah, Alduin's Wall, man, so cool. When I first saw the trailer for Skyrim, I'll never forget it.
It's pretty.
Yeah, it tells their full story, doesn't it? It's awesome. You can just
because But so as it is, they basically set up the empire that culturally, politically, militarily set up basically the foundations of the empire that Tiber Septim would then create later. Because if you really look at it, Alicia's empire it's more like the spiritual foundation rather than so much the actual structure, if you know what I mean. But then, because in between, I guess we could kind of just mention some of these if you want, but in between there's a lot of, obviously the Elder Scrolls Online takes place after the Potentates have been assassinated, the Reman Empire officially falls, but you still kind of got Cyrodiil, there's still legions around, you had Durkarak the Black Drake, and this is what I was talking about with the Reachmen before. Funnily enough, Reman divided them, making it really hard for the Reachmen, because they had to deal with both the Nords of Hafingar and the Eastern High Rock. But then you've got Durkarak the Black Drake, who unites all of these clans, basically makes up a big army of Reachmen, and then goes into Cyrodiil and takes Cyrodiil, and they start the Longhouse Emperor's dynasty, which isn't a legitimate one because of the dragon blood, and same as the Varan Aquilarios guy afterwards, and so on. And it goes on and on in this tumultuous time until Tiber Septim. But yeah.
So something I will say, it's interesting that Versailles was actually murdered when he was in Elsewhere. He was in a palace in Sanchal.
Because he liked the tropical heat and stuff. Because he's a snake.
He's a snake. That's exactly it. He's a snake physically and also quite metaphorically in the story.
Yeah. But and their legacy is interesting. I'm pretty sure if you go to the Remanada, there's the reference to Chevalier Renald as the member of the Dragon Guard who protected their dynasty, but then he would also go and find Tiber Septim.
all of the empires, the legitimate ones, are like connected through some like larger story thread, like, you know, Reman being born of Alesia and Hrol and stuff, but even Tiber Septim being found by the Akaviri Dragon Guard, basically looking for a new emperor. So.
Yeah, it's kind of a cycle of, you know, the Amulet of Kings disappearing, the dragon blood kind of fading away, and then the realization that we need to rediscover it for the betterment of the empire.
Yeah. I'll also say as well, while they are both Saesi, Savrian Chorak is quite different to Vasidju She, especially in the sense that he was kind of seen to be prone to mishandling crises, but he also got rid of the act that banned the formation of local armies. So Vasidju She is like, no. And then Savrian Chorak just chucks it back in. Like, no, you can do that. Also got Orsinium in the Empire.
Yeah,
for a brief,
for that little fleeting moment before he's gone.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, but yeah,
it's kind of it's just like it's kind of a rule for these empires is that you know, with the Remans, they were really dominant and good leaders, but for a very short amount of time. And it's like you know, Reman II being a perfect example of a great leader, but he was too ambitious. And there's also the fact that the Imperials have a tendency to try to, you know, incorporate every land they take into their empire, which can often bite them in the arse in that, you know, it kind of gives them the ability to fight back in the future. But then you have the opposite end of the spectrum in the same empire being the Potentates, who are like rule with much more of an iron scale and, you know, get assassinated for it. You know, so it's the way it goes. Don't start an empire unless you want to get killed.
Pretty much, but yeah,
that's like the least ambitious quote I've ever heard.
They're also so, by comparison, because since we just did the episode on the Elysian Empire, both the Septim Dynasty and the Reman Dynasty are so short-lived by comparison,
but so significant.
Yeah, because it was just.
But there's no 1,000-long-year dragon break as well.
Yeah, but
even
if you take out the 1,000-year dragon break, it's still like Reman Dynasty is like around 200 years, and then Tiber Septim Dynasty is only around 400. Maybe probably closer to 5, getting there, closer to 5. Yeah. But by comparison, you know.
Look, I'll just say this: the flame that burns twice as bright burns half as long.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then again, there's also like a 500-year gap, obviously, between Hestra and Gorius, or Gorius and Hestra. So there's a lot of weird things about the Elysian Empire, but I agree it is like the longest living, as much as they probably weren't loved for a lot of it.
And now it's there's no need for an empire anymore. There's no Amulet of Kings, no ordained emperors anymore.
Receptacle, yeah.
He's got Titus Mede sitting in his ship, waiting to get killed.
Well,
the canon ending for him. What do you think? He's a dead man?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Because they'll run the events, like, even if it's not necessarily, like, the Dragonborn, the canon idea will be someone killed the Emperor. Or they'll say, the Dark Brotherhood killed Titus Mede.
It's just so cool for the setup for Elder Scrolls 6, I think.
Yeah.
If they could work with that. Like, what happens to the Empire? Does it kind of continue to crumble? Does it have a big overhaul and come back? Empire Special Edition.
Imagine if they pulled a meme and in the new one, you were like, assassinate the new Emperor. Again, so they go like the canon ending is Titus Mede was assassinated and a new emperor's in, and then you just so you can assassinate him again in Elder Scrolls 6.
Well, I'll tell you this: if the Second Empire is anything to learn from, we know that the assassinations of emperors can happen in a row. So,
yeah,
it's happened before.
I feel like the Reman Empire is the best one. I do really like the Elysian Empire, but there's only those. To be fair, there's only those like 100 or so years in between Elysia and the rise of the Elysian Order that like I think would be really cool, because after that it becomes this big crazy zealot. It's cool in itself, but it's just this big drawn out like empire thing, whereas Reman's got like really good mythology about building up the origin story, and then it's like, I don't know, I can remember all of the names of the emperors. I know who they all were. They're all characters in themselves.
Yeah, I think I like the Reman kind of in the Second Empire more anyway, but it's definitely mythology is such a massive hook for me. The whole story of his birth, As funny as it can be to meme is also just really, really cool. And the fact that there's this baby with the amulet of kings on his forehead is just, I love it. And speaking like an adult on the throne.
You know those cool, like Chad Virgin memes? I'll see if I can find it and put it up. But there was one with like Reman versus Tiber Septim. It was the Virgin Tiber Septim and the Chad Reman. And he's like this big muscly dude with his like the big amulet of kings in his forehead and stuff. And yeah, it's pretty cool.
Poor Tiber. Well, we'll talk about the Septim dynasty soon, I imagine.
We've actually got a few other episodes planned. We're diverging from the Empire, so it'll be a long while, I think.
Yeah, we got a lot of really awesome topics planned that we want to tackle first. Just mix it up a bit. Yeah. Otherwise, we'll end up on a 5-week in a row Empire binge, and I can't handle that.
No, I could keep going. I love the Empire.
Oh, I do too, but not for 5.
Yeah. No, obviously
in a row.
But yeah, I think that's about it.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for watching. It has been great to be here with Scott and Drew, and having internet that works, not dying this episode was fantastic. And we look forward to nerding out with you all again very soon.